Hello, everyone. Welcome to the episode 10 of Creative Writers and Illustrators. And we are going to be talking about this book by Kavita Mandana, The Teenage Diary of Abaka. So, welcome, Kavita Mandana.
Hi, Shamala. Hi, Nitya. Nice meeting both of you.
Yes. We have two guests today. Our first guest for the day is Kavita Mandana, children's author, and our second guest for the day is a budding historian, Nitya Gundu. She's joining us from Mumbai, and Kavita is joining us from Bengaluru. Am I right, Kavita? You're in Bengaluru, right?
Absolutely.
Yes. So when I first discovered the Teenage Diary series of Talking Cup. There were books on Razia Sultana, Rani Lakshmi Bai, and there were no South Indian princesses. So I was wondering why it was such a trouble writing about these princesses. And that question led me to an interaction with Nitya Gundu, and she had a lot of information. So for the later part of the session, we'll be talking to her and finding out what are the challenges of writing about these princesses. So let's get started with Kavita. So Kavita, how did this book happen? When did you start writing it? Was it before the lockdown or was it during the lockdown? My question, I ask you this question because access to sources is a big thing.
Yeah, actually, the Sudeshna discussed this book, the idea with me. Like she was very clear that I was going to be given a South Indian princess because I've been like little, that where is the South in all the history kind of a thing. And she gave me, actually, she had asked me about Rani Chennamma, and I had this woman in my mind for a long time. I'm very familiar, not with the history of that area, Mangalore coast, but very familiar with, like, it's a place that our family used to go to the Udupi temple every year. So I'm very into that area. I love the space. I love the geography. I love the way it looks. I love the food. Everything I'm very passionate about of that strip of South India. So this Abaka Rani has really been on my mind for years. So it was literally like it landed on my, like, she said, can you do this? I said, not Chennamma, I want to do the Abaka. So she said, go ahead, see if you get enough material. If you have get enough history stuff, go ahead. So that's how it happened. It happened before the lockdown.
So you had access to all the resources. Delhi has National Archives. Does Karnataka, do you have something like that similar in Bengaluru? Did you have to dip into the local, the literature in local languages, Tulu and Kannada as well?
Yeah, you know what the thing is, I suspect the lot about Abaka will be in Tulu, which, either in palm leaf manuscripts or in the Yakshagana, because what has happened is because there's so many Abaka Ranis in that Chauta dynasty, in folklore, she lives on as one queen. Like, the exploits of all the queens, it's a matrilineal dynasty. It's like, it's that same belt like the that goes down to Kerala, like the Nayar women who have matrilineal thing. The Chautas also were like that, like so. I think a lot resides in Tulu, but what I did was I kind of researched around her, the Renaissance writer who has actually seen her and who had written about her in his memoirs. I knew that the Chauta dynasty had a problem with the Portuguese, but had allied with Ahmednagar. So I researched that, so that's just one of the reasons Abakarani is not known about is because actually her kingdom is the size of a Karnataka district, really. It's not even the size of, like, one side of the Netravati river is Ullal, a town, on the other side is Mangalore, and they were enemies.
Right.
One side, so it's such a small thing. So maybe that's one reason why she's not so well known, because of the size of the kingdom that she ruled over.
So both the Abakas have achieved a lot for the Karnataka region. So what tilted the favor in why did you write about Abaka 3 instead of the earlier one?
The thing is, I have to go into historical fiction because we are all imagining that. I felt if I went 3, I could cover what 2 did. You know what I mean?
Get it. Right.
Like I wanted to show the spectrum of this family. Like there's such a bunch of interesting women, and I really wanted to do them because these are not tragic heroines. These are not like fighting for the like there's something very tragic about Lakshmi Bai and even Chennamma. They were both fighting for their adopted offspring. In Chennamma's case, her nephew's son to be accepted by the British, and Lakshmi Bai was her own adopted son. And then they die in battle and all. These were like not tragic. These were like sassy women. Like they periodically sort of fought the Portuguese, sent them packing and traded with the Middle East. And it happened generation after generation. So I like the sass. I like the happy endings where these were victors and they go on happily doing other exciting things. Like they were not defined by the tragedy in their lives or the defeat in their lives. Like they didn't die bravely fighting, they lived on bravely, so I love that narrative.
Yeah. So I think what you're trying to say is if we would have written this book from the earlier Abaka's perspective, we wouldn't have been able to write about this particular Abaka third.
Or if I had to do her grandmother, then if it was a teenage diary, then I couldn't have actually talked about what all the grandmother achieved,
Yes,
because
right.
I would have had to do her teenage diary. So I felt like if I was had to do a teenage diary, then I could all the exploits of the grandmother could be like what these girls are taught, follow in her footsteps. So in that way, I get two abakas for the price of one, kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, the one thing that I wanted to just add, as an observation while I was reading, which, now that you've brought it up, it was something that, delighted me while reading, was that when you're talking about a teenage Abaka, you're also talking about the kind of training that these women went through to become the queens. So like you're not just talking about like there are so many instances where she's recounting the history and the previous experiences that her mother and grandmother would have had, but also there is so much about how she is being trained herself by the men in her family, by the women in her family. So this is just an observation, this is not really a question, but it's something that I really liked reading about, like when you're looking at the teenage character that you've picked. So yeah.
So Nitya, before you ask any questions, you please introduce yourself quickly.
Right. Okay. So I am 23-year-old, despite, appearances, I guess. Yeah. So I have finished my master's in history from Center for Historical Studies in JNU. So I do have quite a bit of research experience in terms of, relative archival work. Unfortunately, mine was, hampered by the pandemic. But so that's my background. I have published a few articles. I have a journal publication coming up. So I'm still working on it, nowhere close to, major historian level yet. But I'm really delighted to be here and talking to Kavita ma'am. Yes. So yeah, should I start with my
question? Yes, please.
No, but please tell us, what was your field? What did you do your
I worked on medieval and early modern India. So one of my dissertations was actually on the transformation of the Bombay city, the growth of Bombay as a port. Because earlier, so I worked on 16th and 17th century western coast. And earlier, Surat was a really important port. And then Bombay becomes one in the 18th and 19th century. So, I looked at how that happened. And that's how I've...
that's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah. So if we need research for some of the book, I'm going to pick her brain. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Please do contact me. No issues.
So
should I start with questions?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So my first question is that as a historian, we're really, when we're trained to study history and how history is written, we are very specific about how it's portrayed, what are the biases that come with reading sources, how it is that we write in an unethical fashion when we are portraying all kinds of, events. Like, for example, especially when you're portraying things like war. So when you're fictionalizing something, there are obviously, like when you make these historical personalities into characters, you're obviously going to, change things up a little bit. Like you're not going to stick to a particular historical interpretation. You have the liberty to change things. So how do you bridge that gap? how do you bridge that space between history and fiction? Because so I have noticed that in your book there are so many details that you have, very you've kept those details and they add to the charisma of your book. So how do you work with the fictionalization part and then the history part?
Actually, in the case of this book, I was so glad for the fact that it was historical fiction, because there's so little that we know about Abbaka. And I don't have, like, there isn't a couple of histories. Like, if earlier on I had written about Akbar for kids with Puffin, that there's so much of information, there's absolutely so much of information. Um, uh, Here they were limited. So I just used the limited information that I had as somewhat like the boundary lines. Like, you can't play outside this compound kind of a thing, like. So given the fact that I know the geography, given the fact that I know the food and the terrain, and I really, like, I, the thing like the Bhuta cult, I've actually been a part of it, and it's so real, and it's so much a part of, like, this is a community, actually, the Bunts from Mangalore, that they're the ones who, like, were part of the banking system in India, like the early banking. Them and the Pais are the ones, Syndicate Bank.
The communities of that
Community
region.
itself is banking, and they're all associated with doctors and engineers and all. So they have that side to them, but they also have this deep side that even though they are Jains, the local thing of the Bhuta cult is so strong. Like the Guttu Mane has such a powerful hold on them, and what that Bhuta cult, it really is very important for even modern. A family full of engineers and doctors would still be. So knowing the community now also helps you sort of flavor your story from that time, like that kind of
Right.
But
So that's
I to answer your question, I was glad that it was history plus fiction, because I had limited access to history, so that
right, right. So I actually did want to know, so which parts were the fictional ones? Because, for example, when I was reading about the war strategies that you mentioned, the Agnivanas, the fire arrows that you mentioned, that is a historical fact. But
Yes,
what were the bits, where you decided that you're going to play around a little with what these women can do? What was that?
Okay, so I like I'm a writer, so lots of masala has been added. So no, for example, like one clue which was really interesting, like I said, this is such a tiny court, right? Like Ulal is just the size of a district. So the other, because they moved, like the Mangalore port was so bombarded by the Portuguese when the Portuguese came up earlier to get rid of the Arabs. I think part of the strategic reason of the Ulal family was to move their capital inland, to Mudabidri. So to not for the Portuguese not to have so much of access to them. So Mudabidri has a lot of historical data, like all the Jain temples and all that. So when you start researching that bit, you get a lot of details. But uh, the things like we know that horses came into slightly northern part of the coast, like Goa and stuff like that. That was a route, and that part of the coast was the place where the Vijayanagar Empire landed up getting all their war horses from. So you know that this area, these things are happening. I know that in this area, like in for example, in this book, the earlier book that I did with
the
emperor
who
who
vanished.
vanished. Yeah, I've written about this, the Dutch East India Company using Konkani Vaidyans to actually access all the medicinal plants from the Western Ghats, along with Malayali Vaidyans. So there's a strong tradition of Ayurveda in these areas, and they're all very close to the Western Ghats. You know that this Renaissance guy who comes and he actually meets this Abhi, Abbaka, where she's older when she's 40, and he talks about how she was walking around barefoot, and she was so unpretentious as a queen. She was not this Mughal empress who would have had 40,000 bodyguards and elephants before her. She was walking barefoot with a couple of guards, and one of them holding, I think, a palm leaf as an umbrella. And she landed up speaking to him very casually, and then sends him to her local palace for her son to entertain, and she goes off on some work. So she really comes across as very down to earth, a people's princess, like without all that pomp and ceremony. So that gave me an idea of, okay, she's walking around barefoot and she's not taking this, white skin guy too seriously, like she's just
Right,
had a
right,
very
right.
polite and dignified talk with him and sent him on his way. It gave me clues of how tomboyish she must have been growing up, how the, getting your um, chops as a warrior would have been more important than the pomp and ceremony aspect of the princess,
Right, right, right.
So different things gave me a clue of how to approach her, rather than having something meaty in my hand about her itself. It was like I was working
Hmm.
around her.
Right, right. So actually, this is leading up perfectly into my next question, which was that so usually Abaka is one. The reason that she's celebrated a lot is that she's seen in typical nationalist historiography, which is something that in when we're studying history, we look at how the earlier historians in the 1920s and 30s looked at history, and that was to glorify the past and look at figures from the past that they could idealize, in the national movement, in the movement to give India that identity of a great nation. So Abaka was also chosen as one of the first women freedom fighters, which is historically a little anachronistic, which is like, out of chronological order, because freedom fighters as a concept comes much later, and Abaka existed in the 16th century. So just because she's fighting the Portuguese does not mean that she was a freedom fighter. But that is how she's seen, that is in Kannada sort of folk memory also, in a way that is how she's seen. So I just wanted to ask you, how did you envision her as a character? Like, did you envision her, like you were saying, as a warrior, as a representative of the the Tulu people, or did you envision her as a freedom fighter as well, in the same vein of how that particular strain of history has gone?
I kind of, we tend to forget, all our the use of the term freedom fighter became so much currency as a mobilizing force against the British. But the British weren't the first colonists here. The Dutch were here before them,
Hmm.
like, and the Portuguese after them. So, and in some senses, I think, like in the north of India, like nobody felt threatened by the Portuguese when they came. The Dutch just, I think, reached as far as Cochin. Like they were basically in
Hmm.
Sri Lanka, and then they came up to Cochin, and then they moved. I think the Java and all became their
Yeah.
zone much more. But the Portuguese came up to, I mean, they were
In
trading
terms of
very
the
much.
navy. Yeah.
Yeah, and also their base was up further up the coast, closer to Gujarat and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
when I was researching Akbar has had them in his court. He gave a couple of his sons to them casually, like, okay, go teach them Roman Catholicism, convert them if you want. He was so not threatened by the Portuguese. So when North Indians look at the Portuguese, they don't see them as a colonist, but
Threat.
from the south, especially from the coast, how the coastal south southwest coast of India had to deal with Portuguese. They were a colonizing power, absolutely a colonizing. So Abaka, I would view her as a freedom fighter because Akbar dealt with them at a completely different, generous. Like we send me pictures of the Pope. Jahangir said, "Bring me paintings from Renaissance Italy." He was an art
Hmm.
lover, and so
Connoisseur, yeah.
their dealings were so different. And the size. I mean, the Mughals just thought in terms of land territory. They weren't even interested. They were happily paying the Portuguese that Cartes for the Mecca pilgrimages. They didn't see them as a
Hmm.
threat at all. But
Hmm.
the South Indian coastal kingdoms were in direct conflict with them, and they destroyed a lot. Like Goa, I mean, the way it was a very brutal occupation of Goa. It was not a
Hmm.
gentle or peaceful, or it was very, very. The Inquisition comes to Goa also, like the horrors of the
Hmm.
Inquisition that happened in Iberia and Spain and Portugal, it comes to there also. So I actually thought of her as this freedom fighter because for Kerala and the Mangalore, South Canara coast, they were an occupying force, and since both those small coastal states didn't really look inland for their revenue, they were not facing India, they were facing the Indian Ocean.
Hmm.
So when
Hmm.
trade
Hmm.
got damaged. Like it was like almost like their agricultural land had been taken because their revenue came from the sea.
Their source of
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, I think that is it, because you ended up answering most of the other, questions that I might have had about the sources and about women, how you are looking at that. So, which is why I think this is the extent of my questions for now. Shamala aunty, you can take over.
Yeah. So, Nitya, I just want you to share with our viewers, some points of our conversation, what we had the other day, as to why it's so challenging to write about Indian princesses, especially South Indian princesses, because we've
Right.
so many books about princesses from the north. What distinguishes them, and what are the challenges of writing about these princesses?
Right. So the first thing, like Kavita ma'am had mentioned, is that so you have to understand where the sources that we are looking at when we come from India, when we are looking at Indian history, where they're coming from. So you have your written sources, which is what she had mentioned, that in the northern part there is a tradition of writing chronicles, of documenting genealogies of, in the Rajputs, for example, there is a very important tradition of documenting their genealogy. For the Mughals, for the Delhi Sultanate before them, there was a Persian tradition of writing histories, tariq they're called. So similarly in southern India,
Internet.
right? Sorry, is there an issue?
Nitya, her internet is frozen. You continue talking.
All right. So in the southern parts, more than the of course there were already also a lot of literary traditions, but and apart from that there were a lot of inscriptions, that sort of a thing, in terms of written sources. But the issue comes when you look at women particularly, and who wrote about them, and how accessible were women to the people who were writing. Now when you look at North Indian princesses as a concept, you're looking at very specific famous people, like people who left a mark as either as an example, or they remained in popular memory, which is why they were written about. For example, your Razia Sultana, since she was somebody who remained in popular memory as the queen of a great, sorry, as the daughter of a great king, as a subsequent queen who had tried to keep her power but had been ousted by nobles, she remains in that narrative. Or if you look at your Noor Jahan, because her story as somebody who was a divorcee, who married Jahangir, and then who herself was known to be a warrior who would go on hunting trips with her husband, who had coins minted in her own name. Or if you're talking about Jahanara, who is the daughter of Shah Jahan, she is somebody who built monuments in Delhi. She built the Chandni Chowk. She wrote, she had trading relations with the Portuguese, which is what something you'd mentioned, Kavita ma'am. So, these women are remaining there. They have very specific narratives associated with them. So that's what they're written about. The thing about South Indian women is that while they were just as commendable, the access to who was writing about this. So if you're looking at royal women, people in the court will write about them. And that is a tradition that existed. Sure. There is a lot of, lot of, there is no tradition of having written about your glories in the same way that there would be in, say, a Persian tradition, So, for example, in the Tamil inscriptions, while there is a lot that is written about the kings, the legitimacy of the queens is not so strong that, you can write about them. Like if you write about the queen, what would you write about? Would you write about the fact that she had so-and-so ships and she traded with so-and-so powers? Would you write about the fact that she was a warrior? Those are the kind of things that as a society uh, was not highlighted, say under the Cholas, for example. So it was not written about in those inscriptions. Or if we are looking at, say, the Vijayanagara queens, they were immortalized in literature, as beauties, or they were immortalized in sculpture. But their own agency as such was not something that came out. And the thing is, this is what I'm talking about in terms of royal women. When we're talking about women who like who were ordinary women, women who worked in the towns as domestic help, or women who were slaves, or those who existed in the rural areas, who, went about their daily life as laborers or tillers or whatever it is, seamstresses. These were women who did not know how to write. Usually in history, women are not the ones who are writing about themselves. So in that sense, their history is completely voiceless, so it's not documented. They're not writing about themselves, and nobody else is going to write about these ordinary women. So that is why, there is such little material. Now, thankfully, about some people, in terms of, say, your Devadasi tradition, which is one of the traditions that has a lot of information about like women who were present at the court, women who were important in these urban town spaces, as entertainers. For them, there is an oral tradition of song and literature that is the reason why they're remembered. For somebody like Abbakka, like we were talking about, there is a massive oral tradition of your theater, the Yakshagana that Kavita ma'am mentioned. So this kind of bardic, folk, oral tradition that exists is something that would highlight women who are, who are making a mark in a certain narrative. That is how women's histories would be written. Otherwise, it's really difficult to find these sources. A second thing is archival material. In South India, there's such less work that is done in these languages. Like ma'am mentioned about, working with Tulu manuscripts or Tulu works written in Tulu. Are they published? Are they translated? If it is Tamil, has it been, accessible beyond, simply those archives? You need a lot of funding to go down to those archives and look at that manuscript and, work on it, get the translator in case you are not comfortable with the language. All of this takes a lot of money, and enough money has not, I can say this genuinely as a historian, that enough funding for this kind of research has not worked yet. It has to be something that comes from the state governments as well. It has to be something that is, funded through other foreign bodies that, you can highlight, saying that there is so much material here that needs to be worked on. There is, so much in the Telangana archives, for example, about like eastern coastal trading that has not been, worked on. That I know that from personal experience. So this is how, these are all these various layers of problems that comes with, talking about sources and women and history. So that's how I would put it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it got a little long.
Yeah, it's fine. Thanks a ton for that, all that information. Kavita, we have very little time, so can you quickly tell us what the book is all about? Let the viewers know. I think we are losing her.
So I've chosen it as 1 year in Abbakka's life.
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yes. Continue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, I've used, rather than in the earlier books in the series where they've used many years leading up to, the diary, I've kind of chosen it as 1 year, a few months leading up to her mother's death, So I wanted them to get a sense of the seasonality, the monsoon arriving, what you can do. There's another thing which is very thriving is that Kambala races, the buffalo races, or the harvest that happens, the months that are separate, that the trading, the ships leave for the Middle East, the past. I wanted to get that seasonality into that, so I chose 1 year, and it's 1 year in her life leading up to the when she becomes queen. So that's how I approached it. It's full of her training, it's full of the adventures that she and her younger sister have. Her younger sister is somebody that we know lived because she's documented, things like that. So it's one action-packed year of 2 teenage girls practicing archery, practicing swimming, practicing horse riding, things like that. So it's full of adventure. It's not, like now we're tending to write fiction, giving women bigger parts so that, they have a role to play in literature. In this case, these queens actually played the leading part. So, we didn't have to write them in. They were the heroes of the story, like they were the ones. So, yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me here today. Yeah, Kavita, I think we have 30 seconds. So if you can tell us about what your previous book was all about. Yeah, that's also from Talking Cub, right?
So the previous, yeah, that's also from Talking Cup, The Emperor Who Vanished.
Yeah.
That's actually interesting or strange tales from all parts of India, like odd and eccentric, like this king who goes off on a honeymoon for 3 or 4 years and then obviously loses his kingdom. Beetles in fashion, like which were harvested from Northeast, and it went into garments and embroidery. So odd and eccentric details from history, but from all parts of India. So that's the Emperor, what The Emperor Who Vanished is all about. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Kavita. Thank you, Nitya. So viewers, do check out this book on Abaka the Third. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shamala. Lovely chatting with you and with you, Nitya. Really great talking to both of you.